Question again, please.
On different, how you perceive the uses to be different of broadcast, cable, or online as far as video is concerned.
Again, I think it's sort of integrated. Like I mentioned previously, and I can't sort of share enough with my clients, that it's really those integrated visuals. So if you see it on the internet, you got to see it on TV. And frankly, you know, if we go to Sharon Engel's race in Nevada, all of the advertising, actually, a lot of it made it very easy for me. It was really fantastic. It was a fun race to do. Because we were doing the negative on the IE portion of it. So when you have visuals, I'm sorry I don't have the ads with me. When we had the visuals of sort of illegal immigrants running across borders or against fences that her team put out, it actually then crossed the line about immigration policy. It was no longer about policy, it was actually about anti-Latino rhetoric. And that's really what drove a lot of the voters in Nevada. And it wasn't just a Hispanic issue, it just wasn't on Spanish language media, it happened on general market media as well. So that actually became viral. I thought it was so fascinating to have a high schooler really take basically a cell phone message of Sharon Engels telling actually a bunch of Hispanic high school students saying, well, you look a little Asian to me, and I wasn't really talking about the Mexican border, I was talking about the Canadian border. And that actually made it a very interesting, viral, nationwide, actually international because it went down to Latin America too, sort of international viral event, basically her calling a lot of Latino kids Asian. So I thought it was fascinating that that actually made it into a nightly news, CNN, everyone actually talked about it, and it was just this really grainy cell phone footage from a high school kid. So you really don't know what's going to hit your campaign, right? You don't know if it's going to be, certainly not from the inside, but maybe from the external, and you just have to sort of roll with those punches. So when that hit the airwaves and the internet, we essentially, there I was writing a script to make sure that I had to redo scripts that we were working on already to incorporate that new development. So it's very fluid, it's very quick, and without a doubt, they're completely integrated. So the viral is affecting the broadcast message, and even though you want to contain broadcast and radio, it's always being shaped by what's going on.
Great. That brings up an interesting thing, or to me it's interesting, is that independent expenditures have gotten so big and so influential in so many races. How do you handle that? I mean, you don't know what they're spending. I mean, I know that the communication between the parties is very limited by regulation. So you're not so sure on the creative slant. Are they going to be going negative? Are they going to be pressing something that you're not interested in them pressing? Do you know how much money they've got and which markets they're coming into? How do you deal with that? Kyle, why don't you lead off with that one?
I'll give you an example, but I'll make another point too. I want to go back to one just thing you said earlier about when you put down the plans and if you have money, how early you start the planning process. When you're working on campaigns, if you've got a race and you don't have any money and you know that these guys are going to show up 2 or 3 weeks out from Election Day with money, one thing you should always do is look at what's going on in the competitive landscape in the market. It just triggered a thought in my mind when you had mentioned this about the independent groups. You should always be watching that because when you execute your own campaign, when you finally get money, you're going to want to integrate into that landscape. And you're going to want to know what's going on a competitive basis. So it's very important to track it. I'll give you one example on integrating with independent expenditures. Not that we necessarily integrated with it, but we worked on the Virginia 5 race. And so that was a race that was 200,000 votes. It was Perello and Robert Hurt. And Perello was the Obama guy. He was running on the Obama agenda. The press loved him because he was standing up for health care and all the terrible things that the Democrats had done earlier on in the year that made the country so angry. He was running on that. We were running as the conservative, of course, anti-health care. The race got a lot of national attention, 200,000 voters in total. There was $10 million dumped into 3 markets in Virginia 5. So I'll break it out by candidate. We spent $1 million. Perello spent $1.6 million. So roughly $2.6 million in candidate spending. All the rest of the cash was all independent expenditure money. Of the independent expenditures, we had 4 on our side, and a total of about $3 million spent in favor of us and about $4 million against us. So it became very, very important for us to watch all that spending because it was just completely overshadowed us, and all the messaging. What the heck are these guys saying about us? And it was not nice most of the time. So that was really a critical piece for that. So my overall point is that these large independent expenditure groups have a huge role now in elections because of the Citizens United decision. And it's something that you have to watch very, very closely and figure out, 1, what's going to be your paid media strategy, and 2, what's going to be your messaging strategy, given that there's so much static going on in the marketplace.
Great, thanks. Fred, do you
I
have?
think that's one of the main reasons that the IE expenditures increased, but also the collapse of the RNC. In a great year for Republicans, nobody wanted to give them money. They didn't trust where the money was going to be spent. So a lot of it started, I think it helped start this push toward IEs. We did 2 that I think are of interest in that regard. One was Ohio, where vast spendings. We did the RGA money for John Kasich. And in that particular case, just like Kyle said, we sort of guesstimated 2 years in advance, or actually a year in advance in that case, we just knew Ohio was going to be a major battleground state. We knew Ted Strickland was a pretty popular governor, and Kasich was an interesting character, and kind of figured all that out. But when our campaign started the summer of the election year, we already knew exactly what creative we'd be running toward the end when the dollars really got high. And so, fortunately, it was a good guess, and we won that race. The most interesting one to me, to your question, was Michigan, where because of an unusual state law, my shop was able to do the IE and the governor's campaign.
Okay.
We couldn't, I was about the only person that knew what was going on both, but had to be a little bit careful. But it was interesting to be able to do that because you can really, we do a lot of IEs and a lot of campaigns, but it was very interesting to be able in one shot to do both and see how that worked. Didn't change much, but it was interesting.
Yeah. Lorena, how do you deal with that?
Well, like I said earlier, I think the IEs have a huge role. They're growing. And what's interesting as the role of the IEs actually grow, you all might be doing better because it seems to be a lot of broadcast dollars are being spent there. I think that the way IEs are structured, a lot of the times the donors are not known. A lot of times big chunks of cash come in very late. And there's just this incredible crush towards the end of the campaign cycle to spend those dollars. And as we saw in 2010, the vast majority of it, much to the chagrin of my mail firm friends, much of those dollars were spent on television. And that just creates this entire cottage industry of trying to churn out all these ads to use up the media dollars. But a lot of times, as Kyle can tell us, there's no media time left, right? And because on IE, which is so fascinating, maybe a lot of people don't know, when you're working with a candidate, you get the lowest unit rate, which is an LUR, and it's guaranteed, and that's the lowest rate. On the IE, which is an independent expenditure or issue advertising, you have a lot of local stations charging almost whatever they want for that 30-second spot. And in fact, I remember we bought media and did the advertising on the IE side for Kamala Harris in California, the first woman of color attorney general in the state of California. She won after a long, protracted recount. But I had rates in the morning, and we got the approval from the client. I started cutting the ad, and my business partner told me 3 hours later, they've just doubled the rate on us. We had to do an NFW and frankly say, we need to go back to the agreement we had. So it's a lot of negotiating. It's like the Wild West in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. And so it's fascinating, it's very exhilarating, but there are a lot of rules that don't apply in that Wild West show.
Yeah, let me ask you all, that leads right into a big concern of ours is that typically in the campaigns these days, about 70% of the money is getting spent in the last 3 weeks. which is putting an incredible amount of pressure, obviously, on available inventory, rates, everything, the whole process. Yet, 36 states now have earlier absentee voting. Some go out as far as a month in advance of the election. About a third of the votes cast were absentee ballot. We don't know whether those were switchables or not, or you know, who they were that were sending the, but at a certain point, does that change the spending philosophy or the spending strategy as far as moving money earlier into the cycle to capture those people? Or not?
Absolutely, yeah, of course it does.
I mean, does that, does that happen? I mean, in theory, it makes sense, but is it actually happening?
I think it happens. What I find is that we now plan to be ahead at whenever that starting point is. So we move voting date back 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever it happens to be. However, one thing hasn't changed in politics, and that is at the end, donors suddenly loosen their checkbooks, and money just pours in. Christine O'Donnell, as you've read in the paper, ended her race with millions of dollars in the bank. And a lot of it came in the last couple of weeks. That was only a 5-week campaign. So, you know, that, I think a lot of that, Jack, while it's frenzy, it's overspending on frenzy.
So the answer is both. You'll
It's both.
continue to have the clog up in the last 3 weeks, but the window will start to
The
open.
effective window has moved up a month.
Right.
And rest assured that as consultants, we are telling our clients we need to plan this out early enough. I remember on the Kerry campaign in '04, basically they were very, very worried that we were going to run out of money. And in fact, John Kerry was left over with $20 million in spending because, again, the frenzy and the crush of those dollars at the very end. And unfortunately, the media plans had already been done, bought, and they were out the door. So it is a struggle.
Interesting. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that too?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sure.
There's a lot to think through when you're, I see this from a different side. I mean, we'd like the late money, all that stuff. And I never say, by the way, that it's sold out. Thanks to all my friends in the room here. But one thing to think about when early voting is going on, you have to look at the states, you have to look at how they regulate it. Some of the states actually give you information on how many people have voted, and you can get some demographic data on it, which is great. They all vary a lot. California, of course, starts really early. We actually had an entire campaign, an online campaign, just dedicated to targeting people for early voting. And now, we had a budget to do that. Most campaigns aren't going to have huge budgets, but we did. And we were also able to integrate some of the broadcast and cable advertising. We set aside a certain portion of the traffic to run to target certain areas to motivate our voters on election day, either to motivate them to early vote or to motivate them to get the form to early vote. So there's a lot you can do research-wise on motivating people, but I think now, especially through paid media, you have to be very, very proactive about early voting in these states.
Yeah, we're trying to do research on it. It's been fascinating because we've been contacting the states to try to get the early voter data. And what they're most concerned about is justifying the early ballots that went out with the ballots that came back, you know, the voter fraud issues,
Right.
rather than when they came back.
Georgia is a good one you should look at.
That's on a county basis.
Right.
Yeah.